Is China's rapid military growth purely for defense, or is a shadow war with the US already underway? Does this expansion and campaign of non-military actions suggest China is already at war with the US? Or are the reasons more complex? In 1996, Taiwan's first direct presidential election triggered the Third Taiwan Strait Crisis. Mainland China responded by firing missiles across the strait. The United States sent 2 carrier battle groups, including the USS Nimitz, through the strait. Beijing was forced to back down. This incident, largely forgotten in the US, is a stark reminder for Beijing of the century of humiliation. China vowed to never be in such a vulnerable position again. Now, 28 years later, after another Taiwan presidential election, the situation has drastically changed. We will examine China's military buildup and its impact on the Indo-Pacific's balance of power. In December 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. This event was arguably more important to global politics than even the September 11th attacks, as China's entry into the WTO allowed it to entrench itself at the center of many of the world's most critical supply chains and become the world's largest trading and manufacturing nation. Beijing took advantage of the vast wealth accruing to its coffers to spend much more money on its military. Between 2000 and 2016, China's military budget increased at a 10% annual rate. Since then, the rate has slowed, but the military budget has still gone up by 5 to 7% per year. In 1995, at the beginning of the Third Taiwan Strait Crisis, China wasn't even in the top 10 of worldwide military spenders. Even Taiwan spent more. By 2002, the first year after joining the WTO, China spent about $30 billion on its military, 10 times less than the United States, and was still behind the United Kingdom and Japan. 18 years later, China spent about $260 billion on its military, reducing the gap to about 3 times less than the United States. However, China's budget actually understates the amount that goes to its military, and China might be spending about $60 billion more per year on its armed forces than advertised. While the United States still has a significant lead in military spending, China is eroding America's dominance in key areas. The United States armed forces are stretched around the world, while China concentrates its military spending in the Indo-Pacific region. China also has advantages in production speed and cost. In 2022, Major General Cameron Holt warned that China was acquiring weaponry at a rate 5 to 6 times faster than the United States. He further warned that China spends significantly less to achieve the same capability. We're going to lose if we can't figure out how to drop the cost and increase the speed in our defense supply chains. China's military buildup accelerated under Xi Jinping, who took power in 2012. Xi has taken a personal interest in military affairs, holding the title of Commander-in-Chief of the Joint Operations Command Center. This gives him command at the operational level, unlike his predecessors. Xi also has strong ties with the PLA, as his father was a military leader. Even Xi's wife, Peng Liyuan, was a civilian member of the PLA with a rank equivalent to Major General. Many of those closest to him are also military men with deep ties to the institution. How has China built up its military? First, it has rapidly expanded its People's Liberation Army Navy, in both numbers and capability. This was an innovation. China has traditionally been a land, rather than a sea power, but its containment in the first island chain, and its dependence on commercial shipping, necessitated a change. With the first island chain full of American allies and choke points vulnerable to being blocked by the United States Navy, the leadership in Beijing determined that it must have a stronger navy of its own. As late as 2010, China had no aircraft carriers. However, China had in 1998 purchased the sister ship of Russia's Admiral Kuznetsov carrier, and after a long odyssey, finally commissioned the ship as the Liaoning in 2012. In 2019, China launched the Shandong, its first domestically produced carrier based on the Liaoning. However, these 2 carriers use ski jumps called the Stow-Bar system to launch their planes. This is slower than America's Nimitz and Ford-class carriers, which use a catapult system. Not wanting to be outdone, China launched the Fujian in 2022. This is China's first wholly domestically designed aircraft carrier, and like its American counterparts, it uses a catapult system. Tellingly, the Fujian was named after the province located across the strait from Taiwan. China has no plans to stop with the Fujian. It is currently building at least one more aircraft carrier, codenamed the Type 004. This carrier, which looks very similar to the U.S. Navy's Gerald R. Ford, will be the first in China's fleet to operate on nuclear power, which will give it the ability to stay at sea for much longer durations than its predecessors, and at much further ranges. Nuclear-powered ships also have an advantage in generating electricity needed to power advanced weapons and equipment. Some American national security experts believe that China could have 5 aircraft carriers by 2031, with the newer ones having nuclear propulsion to give them longer ranges and staying power at sea. China also now has the world's largest navy, with 426 hulls in its fleet as of November 2023. However, many of these vessels are not fit for frontline combat, as they are lighter and less well-armed. This is why despite China's fleet units, it still lags behind the United States Navy in terms of combined tonnage, with the US Navy being about twice as heavy. However, a decade ago, the US Navy had a 3-1 advantage over the plan in tonnage, which shows how serious China is about closing the gap. The gap has closed partially because China is also building cruisers and destroyers at pace. By 2031, China could have 60 of these, with modern capabilities on similar par with the US Navy's equivalent ships. China is also modernizing its submarine force. This is the area of underwater warfare where China lags the furthest behind the United States. It has 72 submarines in its fleet, but only 15 are nuclear-powered, with 6 being ballistic missile submarines and an additional 9 being conventional attack subs. The others are diesel-electric submarines which have less range, cannot dive as deep, and are noisier since they can only run on electric power for a short time. However, China is investing more heavily in its submarine fleet and plans to build 2 new types of submarines, the Type 095 nuclear-powered cruise missile submarine, and Type 096 ballistic missile submarine. In contrast to the Type 094, the Type 095 and 096 in particular are expected to be much quieter, thanks in part to sound isolation technology from Russia. This includes a raft attached to a rubber support system that reduces noise coming from the engine. There is still debate about the origin of the technology being outfitted to the much larger submarines under construction. However, these new underwater craft should be at least comparable to Russia's nuclear Akula-class submarines, the upgraded versions of which are already difficult to detect, according to Christopher Carlson of the U.S. Naval War College. The plan is also gaining more experience on long overseas deployments. In 2008, Chinese naval flotillas were sent to the Gulf of Aden to conduct counter-piracy operations, a feat which has recurred over the years. After these missions, which tended to last for 3 months, the plan would sail to other theaters on much longer navigational missions before returning home. The plan has also seen frequent operations in the South China Sea, giving it more experience in waters further afield from the Chinese mainland. China's naval buildup is only part of its military modernization program. China has also taken pains to upgrade its air force. As late as the 2000s, China's People's Liberation Army Air Force relied on obsolete second-generation jet fighters, like the Shenyang J-6. In addition to obsolete hardware, the PLAAF suffered severely during the Cultural Revolution, which closed many of its technical and maintenance training facilities, leaving it short of trained personnel, especially those who could keep the planes fit for flight. It took decades for China to recover from this disaster. However, the PLAAF has changed drastically since the start of the 2010s. Obsolete second- and third-generation fighters have been retired. In their place, 3 planes have taken the leading role in the PLAAF's fleet. These are the 4th-generation Chengdu J-10C, 4th-generation Shenyang J-16, and the 5th-generation Chengdu J-20. Between these 3 planes, China has 600 advanced aircraft in service, with plans to expand. Between 2020 and 2023, production rates of the J-16 and J-20 doubled. At current production rates, China could field as many as 1,000 J-20 planes by 2030. The J-20 has gotten some improvements as well. In 2022, China began upgrading the plane's engine to the WS-15. Previously, the J-20's engine was the Russian AL-31 that had been developed for the Su-34. As the fighters get outfitted with the new engine, the J-20 should be able to fly at supersonic speed without using its afterburners, super cruise capacity. All 3 of these planes have AESA radars and can be equipped with the PL-15 air-to-air missile, which has a range of up to 300 kilometers. The J-20 in particular may also be getting drone wingmen. Although the details are sparse and must be treated with skepticism, these drones could allow the manned fighter to focus on specialized tasks, like command and control. The drone, which would also be stealthy, could fire 8 intelligent air-to-air missiles or loitering munitions, drones which linger over the battle space before attacking a target. The concept was revealed at the 2023 Zhuhai Air Show. Interestingly, the former obsolete fighters that the PLAAF was so well known for may be turned into drones themselves. Obsolete planes like the J-6 have been spotted by satellite imagery on military tarmacs, despite their being retired. These drones would be easy to spot by radar if they were ever put into combat, but that is part of the point. In a scenario involving Taiwan, for example, these drones could act as a diversion that forces planes to scramble and ignore other areas more important for China's purposes, or they could simply be expendable tools designed to deplete ammunition. The concept has precedent. Starting in 2013, the USAF converted some obsolete F-16S into remotely controlled drones, the QF-16, although this was done purely to turn them into aerial targets. China might see greater potential for this concept. China has also begun building a new type of air refueling tanker plane, the Y-20U, which made its maiden flight in 2018. The aircraft has 3 refueling points. The domestic engine to power this plane, the WS-20, is expected to enter production in 2024. China has also modernized its missile forces in arguably the most successful and strategically significant part of its buildup. China has also modernized its missile forces in arguably the most successful and strategically significant part of its buildup. As early as the late 1990s, the Pentagon was worried about the buildup of China's air and missile forces, which it demonstrated early in the Third Taiwan Strait Crisis. Reports in 1997 suggested that for Beijing, strengthening the accuracy of its ballistic and cruise missiles was a high priority, and that within a decade, China could have as many as 1,000 new projectiles. Washington's expansion of its missile defense networks in Asia further convinced Beijing of the need for a stronger missile force. The May 1997 Quadrennial Defense Review cautioned that while the United States would face no peer competitor in the immediate future, by 2015, there would be the possibility of the emergence of a regional great power or global peer competitor. China now has more than 1,000 ballistic and cruise missiles. The closer one gets to the Chinese mainland, the more missiles there are to hit you. By 2021, China had between 750 and 1,500 short-range ballistic missiles, with ranges of up to 1,000 kilometers, putting Taiwan and every American base in Japan, South Korea, and the northern Philippines at risk. There were between 150 and 450 medium-range missiles, with ranges of 3,000 kilometers, and 80 to 160 intermediate-range missiles, with ranges of up to 5,500 kilometers. These missiles put American bases further afield, like the southern Philippines and Guam, the largest in the region, at risk. China also has an unknown number of cruise missiles that pose additional danger to American bases and ships in the region. Hypersonic missiles have been another item of importance for the Chinese military. American officials have conceded that China currently leads in the hypersonic race. In 2018, Mike Griffin, then Under Secretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, claimed that China had conducted more hypersonic weapons tests than the United States over the preceding decade by a factor of 20 times. China deployed one such weapon into service, the DF-17, in 2019. The DF-17 is a road-mobile, medium-range ballistic missile outfitted with a hypersonic glide vehicle. China further showed its missile capability in the summer of 2021, when it tested a hypersonic device that flew around the world before hitting its target. This weapon was a combination of a fractional orbital bombardment system, FOBS, with an HGV. This was only the most spectacular of China's many missile tests in recent years. In 2022, China conducted more ballistic missile tests than every other country in the world combined. China has also begun to expand its nuclear program. Between 2020 and 2022, it doubled its nuclear arsenal from about 200 to 400 warheads. At current production rates, China could have as many as 1,500 warheads by 2035. The new missiles and nuclear warheads, as well as the Type 096 ballistic missile submarine, which would be able to launch projectiles from Chinese waters with a 9,000-kilometer range, demonstrate China's much improved nuclear capability. In the past, China maintained a program of limited nuclear deterrence. That is now beginning to change, showing Beijing's anticipation of strategic competition with Washington. However, any kind of military equipment, no matter how technologically advanced, is useless without the proper people operating it. This is why China is focusing its military buildup on personnel, as much as it is on weapons or technology. In anticipation of a high-tech military, Beijing has launched a recruitment drive seeking to bring in the country's best and brightest. Military recruiters have stepped up their presence in China's schools in a bid to bring bright young graduates into service. Military recruiters have especially been keen on enlisting STEM majors in the country's universities. The PLA wants 70% of its new recruits to hold at least a university undergraduate degree. As part of its recruitment goals, China increased military salaries by 40% in January 2023. The PLA also offers job security, and Chinese enterprises, especially state-owned ones, tend to give preferential treatment in hiring to discharged soldiers over those with no military experience. Veterans of the PLA will also be allowed to return to combat positions upon re-enlistment. While the recruiting drive seems to be working at keeping the active PLA personnel at a steady 2 million, the world's largest standing army, it is not all smooth sailing. According to China's own polling, only 35% of soldiers who completed their service in the PLA wanted to stay there instead of being discharged to the reserves. College graduates stayed at even lower rates. So while China has made progress in improving the quality of recruits to its military, it will need to take further steps to make it more attractive to the country's most talented minds for the long haul. Like in many other sectors, China also has corruption in its military ranks. As we have seen with Russia's experience in Ukraine, Corruption within a military, especially in its logistics, can manifest deadly consequences on the battlefield. Therefore, part of China's military modernization involves rooting out corruption. As part of his anti-corruption efforts after taking office, Xi Jinping initiated a crackdown in the PLA. In 2013, his first full year, 4,024 officers including 82 generals were investigated, with 21 being removed. The following year, 16 senior officers were investigated. Xu Kaihu and Guo Boxiong, who were both former vice chairman of the Central Military Commission, were investigated and jailed. Although many Western observers have wondered whether corruption in the PLA would impede China's operations the way that corruption among Russia's military ranks has, the low number of officers investigated, less than 1% of the PLA's total, likely means that it will not be as important. Xi continues to claim that anti-corruption is an important part of his military modernization program. In 2018, Xi launched a new anti-corruption drive to ensure that training data would not be falsified. Military discipline officers were sent to the Army's 5 theater commands to monitor drills. The drive was meant to increase the effectiveness of the PLA's training, which included frequent live-fire drills based on lessons learned from Western fighting forces, especially those of the United States. Xi has also made combat-ready training a priority in his military buildup. This objective is reflected in the PLA's frequent exercises with Russia. Before the mid-2000s, Chinese military drills with Russia were rare, amid lingering border disputes from the Cold War. Since then, they have become frequent, with China increasingly playing a leading role in comparison to its strategic partner. Other exercises have also included far-afield drills with Iran. For example, in March 2023, the Chinese, Russian, and Iranian navies conducted naval exercises near the latter's coast. Xi's emphasis on corruption-free training is especially important if China's buildup is to succeed, because the PLA has lacked real combat experience since the 1979 border war with Vietnam, where it did not perform well. Training with other forces, especially those with combat experience, is a vital component for Xi's vision of a modern, first-rate Chinese military. Even though there are lingering problems such as a serious shortage of trained naval aviators, lack of recent combat experience, and certain missing components needed for long-range power projection, such as only about 24 tankers based on 1950s Soviet designs, China's military has come a very long way in the last decade, let alone since the Third Taiwan Strait Crisis. At that time, China was still regarded as a military backwater, lacking in power compared to the United Kingdom, France, and even a Russia in post-Soviet transition. The PLA was often reliant on Russian technology, and completely lacked the know-how to make modern equipment. That is no longer the case. The military buildup, especially under Xi Jinping, has made China a would-be regional great power in exactly the timetable that the 1997 Quadrennial Defense Review predicted. China has greater aspirations still, with Xi setting a date of 2049 to reunify with Taiwan and become the world's leading military power. But will China succeed in this goal? Or will economic, demographic, and other institutional problems prevent this from occurring? Or are there many more problems under the hood for China's military? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more geopolitical news and story.